we'll do the live thing first. Like, hey everybody, thanks for listening again. If you haven't yet, go hit subscribe, hit the bell for your notifications, comment, like, and share for us. If you can rate the podcast, please do wherever you listen to it. We love you and we want to keep growing, so help us out. Tell your friends. Love ya. Hey everybody, welcome back to the podcast. I'm your host, Bigmark. And I wanted to talk to you this week. I got you, just me and you, we're sitting down, and I want to talk about psychedelics. It's part of the show. We've talked about it a lot with a lot of the guests, and I wanted to finally kind of just talk to you guys about it and really set the record straight about everything. First things first, obviously a lot of these drugs are illegal. I'm not condoning going out and doing it. There's a lot of therapeutic methods. There's ways you can get. There's a lot of therapists out there that are doing more legal guided psychedelic sessions, which is awesome. But that's a little bit more of a new thing. And I suggest before you do anything, really do your research on all this stuff. But I just wanted to kind of share my own journey. I wanted to talk a little bit about a little bit more of an intro to things, and then if you're ever to do them, maybe some pointers that I've heard and learned in the past. So psychedelics, it's from the Greek psyche, mind, and delos, to make visible and reveal. So reveal is part of the mind. They're substances that induce a heightened state of consciousness characterized by a hyperconnected brain state. So there's sometimes, if you've ever seen, there's fMRIs, functional MRI machine images that show the brain in different states when it's in there, and a lot of times when they put a patient or a subject in there that is under the influence of psychedelics, their brain is just lit up like a Christmas tree. And that's basically what that's saying, is that all those interconnected parts of the brain that seemingly would not be connected, when psychedelics are introduced, those parts just completely engage, and they completely activate way more so than normal. Some of the best known psychedelics are psilocybin, obviously found in magic mushrooms, DMT, which is found in I guess a Southern American brew called ayahuasca, and mescaline, which is found in the peyote and the San Pedro cacti. LSD or acid, and 2CB, which is kind of like MDMA or ecstasy, but it's a little different form, because MDMA is actually more of a stimulant than a classic psychedelic. Those ones I just listed, those are kind of more your top ones that are either just more popular, more studied, or those are just the ones that in history have been used a lot more. In my journey, when I've mentioned before, it's kind of funny that when I was playing football, before and during the season, you weren't allowed to take a lot of substances, obviously performance enhancing ones, and then also like you couldn't smoke any weed. And then actually, funny enough, if you were drunk during competition and they tested you and you got caught and you were drunk, then you'd actually get in trouble too, which, hey, that's cool. Hopefully no one's really getting drunk. But funny enough, that actually led me to doing my first mushroom dose too, because we weren't allowed to smoke weed. We were kind of like, hey, well, what are we going to do? So I tried mushrooms, and more or less just felt a connection right away. I didn't have any really ill effects. Didn't do too much. I did 3.5 grams, which is, pretty solid dose for most people. Now, I am who I am, 6'7", 320 pounds, big guy, have more body mass. So when I'm taking certain substances, obviously I have that in mind. So again, not condoning any of this, but if you're taking any of my advice at all, just keep that in mind too. But you know, a Terence McKenna, who I'll talk about in a second, he describes something called the hero's dose, which is supposed to, and that's of psilocybin mushrooms, 5 dried grams, and that's supposed to take you on a major journey. That'll introduce you to something called ego dissolution, which hopefully we'll get to in a little bit as well. But more or less the way so from then of my first experience with mushrooms, it just kind of opened my eyes to, you know, really a lot of the stereotypes that go along with psychedelics aren't necessarily true. A lot of it is unfortunately inflated by the media. And, you know, one of my favorite comedians, his name's Bill Hicks. I actually started getting into him more so after I tried mushrooms, but that I think was just a coincidence. But he happens to talk about it a lot, and he talks a lot about how mainstream media tends to overinflate the dangers in the world, period. Kind of makes you think that as soon as you step out of your house, something bad's going to happen. But really, most of the time, you know, it's not as bad as it may seem. And the best example of that is the way that they convey psychedelics, any drug use apart from alcohol and tobacco, but any drug use is usually pretty poorly conveyed in the media. As of very recently, things are starting to get a little bit more popular, especially like Canadian style media, but more or less historically, they've just been, you know, the classic story, and this is what Bill Hicks says too, is a, you know, classic story. Man tried too much LSD, jumped off his roof because he thought he could fly. And Bill Hicks said, well, why didn't you try jumping off from the ground? Right? Like, you know, you don't see ducks taking the elevator to the Empire State Building to go and fly, right? So anyway, Bill Hicks goes on to it, and he's a little bit more harsh, but he's kind of, you know, he's someone who's going to really, he was one of those comedians who could really kind of cut to the quick and kind of smash your own potentially preconceived notions. And that's what was the humor. That's where the humor actually came from, was him just opening your mind to these new experiences. So I ended up watching a documentary about him, really, really good documentary called The Story of Bill Hicks, or The Bill Hicks Story. Whoops. Anyway, super cool. Talks about his whole life. He was a comedian in Austin, Texas. I think Austin, but super young. He was like one of the youngest comedians to ever really start doing it. I think he was like 19, like working at the Comedy Store in LA, which is amazing. Anyway, so he, I guess later in life, he wasn't really a big drink. He didn't drink at all. He was a young guy. He was obviously underage, being 19 in the States, but he just wasn't into that. But he tried magic mushrooms one day, and I think in like southern states, like it's a little bit more popular, like they kind of grow everywhere, where in Canada it's obviously a little bit harder to find. But like literally you can like Theo Vaughn always talks about, like you can just go out into a field and there's going to be some growing somewhere. So I think, you know, being from a southern state, he could probably just get a hold of them. So he tries them and just kind of fell in love with them. And in the documentary, really talks about how they made him feel, and he did it with some of his friends, and they would do them relatively regularly. But this one time where he brought everyone together, and these are like his childhood friends, and they took these, and it was during this harmonic convergence, which I guess was some astrological or anyway, some type of event that was happening with planetary alignments or something. And they did 5 dried grams, which he had heard Terence McKenna talk about or read, but he did the 5 dried grams, and they experienced like this harmony and unity together, where actually when they first discovered either DMT or another, I think it was DMT, they wanted to call it harmine or like telepathine. But anyway, some of these psychedelics tend to have this effect where you feel like this interconnectivity with either the people that you're doing with, or honestly all the people in the universe. And there was one time on our last podcast with Christian Aubin, we were talking about that collective unconscious and that morphic resonance. And I think when you're taking these substances, it kind of helps you tap into that a little bit better, because we'll get into that a little bit later, but essentially Bill Hicks then turned me on to Terence McKenna with this whole, because I thought 5 dry grams, Terence McKenna, who's this Terence McKenna guy? So I started looking into him, and basically he is more or less the father of like modern psychonautics, if we want to call it that. So essentially psychonautics would be like if aeronautics or astronautics, like if you're an astronaut, you are going into space and you're going to explore space. And basically a psychonaut, you're exploring inner space, because outer and inner space are infinite, but obviously outer space is a little bit more tangible, a little bit more physical, where the inner space can be so abstract until you start introducing these substances, funny enough. Because really, all the songs I've heard growing up, and this is another Bill Hicks, but he's like, if you're against drugs, go to your albums and delete all of them, throw them all out, because all those musicians that wrote all that music were real high on drugs. That's his line, and it's beautiful, and it's true. But I never really got it too much. Like, obviously being a kid, like getting into classic rock and listening to freaking Pink Floyd, like in grade 8, you don't really know what's happening. But those thoughts kind of, I guess, stay with you. And, when you do it, it's reaffirming, it's potentially confirmation bias, but you just, all that stuff, all that more or less abstract stuff that you'd think like, oh, that's just, that's just the artist's mind, that's just the artist's expression, they're just taking something. A lot of times there's certain aspects in art and film and music that are represented, and they do come from this other kind of realm, if you want to call it. So there's another word for psychedelics called entheogens, and basically they're psychoactive substances, typically of plant origin, that are used in a religious, ritual, or spiritual context. And that's essentially what that all hits on, is that whether it's the basis of religion or just that whole inner space that exists, the psychedelics can kind of take you to that place. A really, really good book, if you don't really know much about psychedelics at all, excellent book is by Michael Pollan, is called How to Change Your Mind, or what the new science of psychedelics teaches us about consciousness, dying, addiction, depression, and transcendence. And basically Michael Pollan used to be like a food writer. He wrote a lot of books about food and origins of food and anthropology, and also just general food, and really cool books too. One called The Botany of Desire, and this other one that he basically talks about, like, that there was like 4 main foods that are plants that we co-evolved with, and it was like the potato, the rose, the apple, and cannabis, I think. I don't know if the rose is one of them, but anyway, or tulip. But anyway, these plants actually co-evolved with us, and as much as we influenced their evolution, they also influenced ours. Very interesting book. I digress. I'll go into that another time. But the coolest thing about Michael Pollan is that he really likes to live his content. So he likes to, whatever his subject matter is, he involves himself in it. So, obviously with food and stuff, pretty low risk involvement. You get to eat some food. Some of it might not taste good. Some of it might make you sick. Hopefully not a lot of it can kill you. But when he wrote this book about psychedelics, he wanted to try all the psychedelics that he was going to write about. So I think he did MDMA, again, not a classic psychedelic, but it's kind of becoming more popular because it's being used in a lot of therapeutic treatments for depression and anxiety. But I think he had smoked cannabis in the past. He did LSD and psilocybin, I believe. And these are all like guided by a therapist, by a practitioner who's going to be there and walk him through this whole process. And it was very, very, very safe. And again, I will reiterate that when you do this, make sure you've done your research, make sure you're doing it in a safe setting, and we'll get into that a little bit later. But make sure you're comfortable, and don't ever do anything you don't ever want to, especially psychedelics, for sure. But again, look into Bill Hicks, look into Terrence McKenna a little bit more, because both of those guys really opened my eyes to, that a lot of the information that's out there about psychedelics isn't necessarily 100% accurate. And it's also written and created by people who probably have never experienced it themselves. And a lot of these psychedelics got added to this sweeping psychedelic act, like back in the 60s and or 50s even. And anyway, I might be wrong on that, but it was completely brought on this war on drugs that we all know has become pretty futile. And there's a lot more things that we can be focusing on and trying to help people. And unfortunately, a lot of this, because this stuff has been made illegal, it's also been hard to research a lot of this stuff. So we actually don't know its true effects. It's just gone on the fact that things are illegal, and that usually conflates into some kind of propaganda or some type of misinformation that, the telephone game of life, as things get passed down from person to person, things just get mixed up, and, that's kind of the way things go. A little bit more history on the psychedelics. They've been used for thousands of years by many, many cultures around the world. They found that in ancient Egypt, they were preserving psilocybin mushrooms in honey, and actually, if they left that honey too long out, it would start to ferment. So a lot of the early alcoholic beverages also had like mushrooms in it. But then there was like a Bavarian Beer Act or something in like the early 14th century or something like that. Totally making this up. Sorry about the dates, folks, but that's how we rock on the Bigmark podcast. But at a certain point, they said, no, you can't put mushrooms in beer. So for a long time, beer and magic mushrooms were like this big, huge thing, because it kind of started from that honey, the mead, that potentially had this more psychoactive kind of process feeling to it. It wasn't just alcohol. It was a psychoactive drug, really. And the ayahuasca in South America, this is, we're starting to talk a little bit more modern, obviously, but essentially these civilizations in the jungle found two different plants that do not grow together. So ayahuasca essentially is a drinkable form of DMT, or dimethyltryptamine, which is actually an endogenous chemical in the human brain, but it's found in thousands of plants. But our bodies have this special enzyme in our gut called monoamine oxidase inhibitor. So basically what that means, this enzyme doesn't allow us to break down monoamine oxidase, which essentially breaks down, or that allows us to pass DMT through the blood-brain barrier, or like we can absorb it through our gut, and then it will pass through the blood-brain barrier, which means it's going to be psychoactive. But essentially, this root and this bark of this tree that don't grow anywhere close to each other, shamans in these ancient cultures found a way to put this together, basically make this brew, and when you drink it, the root has the monoamine oxidase inhibitor, and the plant and the bark has the DMT. Might have mixed those up as well. Hey, I'm being honest with you guys, because it's just me and you here. I'm just going to be talking with you, But the DMT and the monoamine oxidase inhibitor allows the DMT to cross through that and be absorbed. And essentially, it just is this major visual, and it's considered one of the more intense psychedelics that do exist. And you're going to see a lot of visuals and have intense spiritual awakenings, and a lot of A lot of people have gone done ayahuasca to help them with certain other addictive behaviors or certain problems, and it has helped them major and shown them different things. And it can be very emotional. It can be very intense experience, but I think if you're doing it with the right people and you have the right people to help you reintegrate, which is something we'll talk about in a sec, super important. You can get through those things and have a really healthy and healing experience for sure. North American Indians also use peyote, the cactus I had mentioned before, which contained mescaline, which is another one of these substances. So a lot of these substances are 5-MT2 inhibitors, which mean, or an agonist, receptor agonist. So 5-HT2 agonist. So basically in your brain, you have certain receptors that they're the ones that interact with serotonin. So basically being an agonist, most psychedelics, classic psychedelics, they increase the activity of serotonin in your brain. So essentially they'll go on to that 5-HT2 inhibitor, 5-HT2 receptor, and they basically look like serotonin. And when they it's like a key and a lock scenario. When they bind with this receptor, it then propagates down that neuron and it activates. So a lot of those neurons exist in something that's called the default mode network in the brain. The default mode network is essentially, so when you're like driving down, you're kind of daydreaming, thinking about things, time traveling, you're still thinking about something in the past, thinking about something in the future. Essentially, that is the default mode network in your brain. Set up different structures in your frontal cortex. But essentially what researchers have found is that psychedelics shut down this part of the brain. So default mode network is responsible for a lot of self-critique. So what most researchers are thinking is that this is the seat of what we like to call the ego. So it's essentially the physical proof that we have this part in our brain. And they think evolutionary wise, it exists for survival. It helps us, the theory of mind, make sure we try and understand what other people are thinking. Basically, anytime I say this, I probably said it before, the ego is what you think other people think you are. So you can't validate that. It's really tough, but it's something that's going to guide you through life. However, a lot of people let this run amok, and they're always in that default mode network is always turned on, and they're always self-critical, and they're always worried about things, and they're maybe a little bit paranoid. But that's where that whole feeling resides in the brain, and psychedelics have been found to shut that down. So that's basically the whole ego dissolution aspect of psychedelics. So certain psychedelics and certain doses will essentially turn this default mode network off and give you a feeling of like selflessness, essentially. So that's what I mean, where you kind of feel like you're more at one with the whole with the collective unconscious and the whole morphic resonance. That's kind of that feeling of oneness starts to exist. And again, that the default mode network exists for survival, but we're starting, and our culture exists, that we don't need to be constantly in fear and in this state of paranoia all the time. And I think that's what we're going to slowly, if our culture and species continues to evolve, is that we'll start to highlight that more and start to understand that, we're not in this constant danger, and a lot of the dangers and anxieties and issues that we have in our lives are created just by ourselves. And even even problems that we have in the economy and other things, they are man-made creations. But because the ego drives us so much, we forget that that's actually what's going on. That we forget that there's so much more to life, and that there's love in the universe and in between people too. And unfortunately, the ego can drive us to do a lot of things that aren't so nice to others. Let's just put it that way, right? So, not to say that we should exist without the ego, but I think, and what I've found through help with psychedelics, is that the ego is there to guide you, but you need to do the proper work to make sure that it doesn't take over your whole life. Because I think a lot of people do exist out there that are completely driven by the ego, and it's kind of a shame for sure. So another one, so a little bit more information on recent studies. So there was a study at Johns Hopkins School of Medicine. 80% of those who received psilocybin said it was one of the 5 most meaningful experiences of their lives. 50% said it was the single most meaningful experience. So again, like when you're doing these things, like it's not just it's not pedestrian. It's not just a walk in the park. It's gonna be meaningful, and it's gonna be intense. And as we all know, most of the things that mean a lot to us are really intense. And I think that people can shy away from that, and they're worried that there's gonna be potential repressed memories or certain traumas that might crop up. But again, when you're surrounded by a therapist or a proper guide, if some of that stuff does crop up, you can have someone there to talk you through it, and again, be aware that those things can come up, and know who you're experimenting with, because a lot of those feelings of interconnectivity, you start to also share that kind of emotional feeling too. And if you're not surrounded by the proper people, sometimes that state can be affected by other people's emotional states. And again, that's a lesson that can be learned in life too, is that as much as we look at our emotions that we feel we want to own them, a lot of those feelings also come from outside, and they're not really just us. It's also just the entire universe maybe, but that collective unconscious ebbs and flows through certain, things happen in the world, and there's still wars that happen, but then there's still major joys, and those things usually end up balancing themselves out. But some days things may be a little bit more joyful, and then some days may be a little bit more sorrowful. But that's the thing, is that what that starts to open your eyes to is that sensitivity to those feelings really comes from trying the psychedelics, for sure, because it amplifies that feeling for sure. And like I mentioned in the meditation podcast too, you can get there through breathing work and holotropic breathing and transcendental meditation. You can get to there. It's just going to take a lot of practice, and it's going to take a lot of time. And not to say that this is a shortcut or the easy, because the shortcut implies that it's easy, right? But it's going to get you to certain places a lot faster and a lot more efficient. But unfortunately, there's people out there, and maybe you're too young, or you don't understand, and you're trying these things, and you're trying to party with them, and you're doing all these things, and then you have a bad trip, and you're like, well, what'd you think was going to happen? Again, you're not taking this thing seriously, that for thousands of years our species have dealt with and treated properly, and treated as a sacrament, really. Now, there's some thoughts. This John Marco Allegro, he was a Dead Sea Scroll like researcher, I guess. What do you want to, what could I call that? Scholar, sorry, Dead Sea Scroll scholar. Jesus. And hey, funny enough. Anyway, he was one of the first people to look at like the Dead Sea Scrolls when they found them, and the Dead Sea Scrolls, for those that don't know, were basically they're the earliest known writings of the Old Testament, or the New Testament. Sorry, the New Testament. So about Jesus, and essentially, what they found is that a lot of or what John Marco Allegro says, so he's pretty controversial in this. He's one of the only people that is really saying this, but that essentially Christianity is like a fertility cult that uses mushrooms in the ceremony. So very controversial, but it talks about how the body of Christ is potentially the mushroom, where you're actually consuming that, and then maybe the whole mass ceremony was a part of this large mushroom ritual. And then, you know, the halos in a lot of Christian Christian artwork has little lines in them that almost look like gills of a mushroom. Even in the Adam and Eve story, they think that the tree of life potentially was a mushroom. Again, you can look into this a little bit more, but ancient history does speak a lot to us using these in a much more sacramental, much more, you could say, quasi-religious, but spiritual way. And it has to be that right mindset. It has to be that you are taking it seriously and respecting these plants and medicines, and even the, like LSD, the more synthetic psychedelics that do exist. There still has to be that respect, because it's a humbling experience. There's going to be humbling experiences, but, you know, even more in our history too, Amanita muscaria, which is the classic magic mushroom. You know, it's like the emoji that's like red with like white dots on it. So that's like the classic mushroom. We kind of think, like, why is that such a big part of our culture? Like, why even is there an emoji? Right, Mario. What's funny, Mario eats a mushroom and he grows. Like, it's wild. Anyway, when long history of use with Amanita muscaria, some research shows that Vikings would eat it, and they'd eat it before battle. And they go out, the berserkers that were these guys that just go wild and fight. Yeah, that's what they would eat. They'd eat all these mushrooms before battle. And Amanita muscaria is a little bit different because it's not necessarily a 5-HT2 agonist. It's some acetylcholine or something. It's another neurotransmitter that it is involved with in the brain. So it's not kind of your classic visuals. And more introspection that you'd normally get from a psilocybin mushroom, but it's still a psychoactive mushroom. And they would, when the Vikings would eat this mushroom, and then they would go in. Obviously, Vikings more or less originated from Norway, like modern Norway and Sweden and Scandinavian area. That when they would go and take a pee after eating these mushrooms, that they would almost get bowled over by reindeer. Reindeer loved eating these mushrooms, and even the urine, because once you eat it, your body actually excretes it in a more excretes the active ingredient in a much more concentrated form. Don't ask me, but that's how it works. And funny enough, they think that the Amanita muscaria is also linked to Santa Claus, believe it or not. So Amanita muscaria obviously being red and white. Santa Claus's gear is all red and white. Amanita muscaria really only grow in northern climates under pine trees. They freaking look like Christmas trees. Now, when people would pick them, you have to dry them first before you eat them, and you put them in the tree. And there'd be like these little red things in a tree, like freaking ornaments, right? Reindeer love it, and it's tripping and makes them high, aka makes them fly, right? And what they think is the shamans in these small Scandinavian towns, when there was so much freaking snow, the front door, you couldn't get through the front door, but you could go through the chimney with a sack of mushrooms. Anyway, that's what they think about Santa and the Amanita muscaria mushroom. Pretty wild for sure. But again, this is kind of that's how deep in our history that we have dealt with. And there's only one culture in the entire world that doesn't use any psychedelic drugs like normally, and it's like the Inuit people, because nothing grows up there for them to eat. But every other culture in the world, they have some type of psychoactive plant that they use, which is really, really interesting. Um, Another more recent, actually not all that recent now, in a 2010 study published in top medical journal, The Lancet, rated LSD and magic mushrooms among the safest of 19 commonly used psychedelic substances, 12 times safer than alcohol, 4 times safer than tobacco. So again, media has probably overhyped the dangers, and that's probably another podcast, but you go into many reasons why. And again, it was probably, and most of it's linked to the fact that it was, all these drugs were kind of swept up in this psychedelic act that mostly was attacking marijuana at the time, like cannabis at the time, because this William Randolph Hearst guy, who was a paper magnate, big, huge, this is a long story, but he basically ran like newspaper production in all America. And at the time, this decorticator machine came out, and it was going to make hemp paper a lot easier to produce. And he wanted to have the whole lockdown. This Hearst dude wanted to have the whole lockdown and everything. So he basically worked with Harry Anslinger, who was working with I think the freaking FBI or something like that. I can't remember at the time. And they created this act to outlaw marijuana, and then just threw all these other substances in there just because they're like, well, might as well. And they missed DMT, which is like arguably the most powerful one. So like before, you could buy like a freaking jug of it and it was totally legal, blah blah blah. I think now it's been put on the substance list, but yeah, again, these are things that are a lot safer than we think. They've been with our species for a lot longer than we think. And again, if you're ever called to do it, if you ever feel like you've done your research and you've done it, again, I'm not saying go out and do it, but if you ever find yourself there, remember set and settings, your mindset and the setting and where you are. So where you are doing the trip, taking the substance, because your environment is going to really affect things. And a lot of people don't take that into account. And that's when you can have bad trips or challenging trips. And also remember, if things do start going dark, that it's okay and it's not going to last forever. And make sure you have someone with you to reassure you that, because that's where people mostly get caught up, is they think it's going to last forever. And certain drugs like LSD is going to probably last about 12 hours. So it's a long time, but it also dilates time. So it makes time seem like it's going to last way longer. And again, you just want to have someone that's able to reassure you, or just, again, through your research and through your own self-searching before you even touch any of these, just know that it's going to be that if you ever do witness anything or encounter anything that is challenging, just know that there is something there to learn from that. And a lot of people just look at these bad trips and they say, man, that sucks, and that drug is bad because it made me feel that way. And it's like, if you look at it like maybe it's a cleansing aspect, and maybe you've got that out of the way, or maybe you're revisiting certain parts of your mind and thoughts or feelings that you've not wanted to deal with for a long time. I think that's important, because it can hold you back so much, these thoughts and these feelings that just you fight, and you spend so much energy trying to repress and trying to push down that. And that's probably part of that default mode network again. But as soon as you shut that off and you let those things come to the surface, it can be very refreshing. It can be very what's that? Rewarding 100%. But it allows you to kind of reset. And, one of the best analogies I ever heard about psychedelic use is that imagine your mind is like a ski hill, and there's all these different runs, and so at the end of the day, and when you go down, you can't help but kind of go into these certain grooves that already exist, right? And those are our thoughts, and those are our those are the habits and things that we do habitually. And as much as we think that that's just part of our daily routine, or that's just our own choices, a lot of those things are just because it's kind of, we're going through those motions. And what psychedelics can do is it's kind of like, an avalanche coming down and completely covering the hill in brand new, perfectly white snow. and it allows you to then go back in those grooves if you want, or go down a whole new pathway. And that was one thing I mentioned earlier that's super important too, is integration. So set and setting, utmost importance. Reintegration or integration is super important as well. So taking what happened during your trip as best you can, because some substances can be a little bit harder to remember everything, but taking those things you learned or those challenges that you encountered and reintegrating that into your life, and realizing that, okay, this is awesome. And, you know, sometimes you might experience like a feeling where you don't really know how you're going to kind of how you could possibly integrate that into your life, but it's going to take time, and it's going to take conversations with hopefully the people that you did it with. And it's going to be you have to be open, and you have to be, you know, you want to be honest, because this is an honest, very, very honest venture, and it's going to be humbling, and it's going to be something that takes a lot of bravery, and it's not easy to do, but when you do it, you know, you can learn so much, and it does apply to life, and it really, you know, it does help with so many aspects. And, you know, when you learn the way broadly you see it in everything. So when you take these and you expand your mind and your consciousness to these utter depths and utter lengths that you never would have ever fathomed, and all these realms and different potential dimensions that you experience, all reside right here in front of us, even just right here between our ears. Because at the very least, you know, you can think, oh, this is all just chemical reactions in my brain, and none of this is spiritual, and all this stuff is just because I've taken a drug. But all you have to do is just take a small little substance, like LSD comes on a little piece of paper. All you have to do is that, and your whole reality is changed, and your perspective, and the way you hear music, and the way you sense certain things, and the way you think about things is all of a sudden changed in a fashion that you don't even really... If you reach full ego dissolution, it's essentially an out-of-body experience, and, you know, that's all it takes is one little tiny substance. To me, that's enough to say psychedelics have serious potential to really teach us something about the reality that we live in. And we can put so much, when we don't have these experiences, we can put so much stock into this reality that we just sense with our five senses that aren't all that accurate. We perceive a very small slice of what physics and science tells us is this large spectrum, whether it's the visual spectrum or the auditory spectrum. Humans' ability to actually experience the world is extremely limited. But when you introduce these psychedelics, you can expand that experience, and I think that is essential in not only for your own experience as a human being, but the way you interact with others and the way you can understand people is only going to be heightened. It's only going to be magnified by doing this, because it does create, by doing psychedelics, because it does create this feeling of unity and this feeling of oneness that can only truly be experienced. And I think that the more people that do experience that, it can only lead to a more empathetic life, and really understand that we can get past this. And as Bill Hicks says, we can explore inner and outer space together as one. And if you choose love over fear, every time we'll only take our steps in that direction. And again, be careful. Like I said, I love you guys. I want you guys to be safe, but I want to talk to you about this because this is something that will come up again and again on this podcast. And, you know, if you guys are listening still, I'm sure you guys are interested in it too. keep doing your research out there. Anything that you guys ever want to talk about, like I said, hit me up on the email, DM us on Instagram, on Twitter. We're always here to listen to you. We'll always get back to you. And again, tell your friends, because we want to spread the word about the Bigmark podcast and everything that we talk about, because it's only going to inch our experiences towards love a little bit more. And that's what it's all about. So thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you soon. Cheers.